And it's troubling that that's the message that he would send to his people and to other governors. Because we are a nation of laws, and I think that people need to understand that whether it's the laws that he passes as the governor of Connecticut or the laws that are passed through Congress and signed by the president, there's a reason that a democracy works. It's because the people speak, our representatives, at every level pass a law, and the executive in that particular branch of government signs or vetoes it, and then we live by those rules. And the idea that you can decide which laws to agree or not to agree with, or follow or not follow, undermines our entire rule of law. And so I would suggest that is not a great sign to be sending to the people of Connecticut and the people of this country, that a particular governor chooses not to follow the duly passed laws of this nation. With respect to sanctuary cities, I think this is an area that the American people, by huge amounts, support. They recognize their tax dollars shouldn't be spent supporting programs and activities which people are not entitled to. And so I think the president has been very clear on this, that if you are a sanctuary city, declared or undeclared, if you are providing benefits or services, we're going to do everything we can to respect taxpayers and ensure that your states follow the law. April.
Sean, on the bathroom issue.
Yeah.
There was a different comment from the president about, if people like Caitlyn Jenner wanted to use his bathroom in the Trump Tower, she could. Now, what's happened?
No, I think that's, so just to be clear, the president was asked at one point if Caitlyn Jenner was in Trump Tower, and he said, that's great. That's consistent with everything he said. It's a states' rights issue. And that's entirely what he believes, that if a state wants to pass a law or a rule, or an organization wants to do something in compliance with the state rule, that's their right. But it shouldn't be the federal government getting in the way of this. I mean, if you look at this, the law that was passed in 1972 did not contemplate or consider this issue. Number two, the procedure for this guidance letter that was done through the Obama administration was not properly followed. There was no comment period. There was no input from parents, teachers, students, or administrators. None. So if we think about how this was implemented last administration, there was zero input, there was zero comment period offered. Teachers and students never had any say in how this was implemented. Number three, there's a reason that the Texas court had this matter enjoined. It's because it didn't follow the law and it had procedural problems. Four, as I mentioned, it's a state right issue. And then five is I think that we do have to recognize that children do enjoy rights from anti-bullying statutes that are in almost every state. And that there's a difference between being compassionate for individuals and children who are struggling with something, wanting to make sure they're protected, and how it's being done. And I think that the president has a big heart, as we've talked about in a lot of other issues, and there's a big difference. Personally, he addressed this issue when it came up with respect to one of his properties. But he also believes that that's not a federal, it's not a federal government issue. It's an issue left to the states, and it's an issue that, I mean, there's a reason in August of last year that the court enjoined this, because it hadn't followed the law, and it hadn't the procedure, the comment period, and the solicitation of opinions and ideas wasn't followed. It was jammed down the process, and so we're actually following the law on this one, and I think that's the way it's supposed to be done. John,
hold on. If I could just follow on what April said. Okay. The Human Rights Campaign.
I wasn't finished. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, I'm following on your question.
I understand.
Why don't we let April follow on, and then we'll get to John and Kristen and.
So I have something on another issue really fast, and John can do that. On the HBCU executive order, we understand the executive order is coming out sometime later this month. It's supposed to open, you're working out issues of opening an office specifically to take the HBCU initiative out of the Department of Education and bring it directly under the purview of the White House. Who will be heading that? Have you figured that out? Have you also figured out how you will build that office out?
Yeah.
Because we understand that is one of the big pieces of this.
Well, respectfully, that's why it hasn't been issued yet. We're working it through the process. Obviously, that is something that we're committed to getting done by the end of Black History Month. So our days are numbered, but there's a commitment by the president and the staff to really focus on this issue and give it the proper respect that it deserves. So if you'll bear with us a couple more days, I promise you we'll have more to say on that.
So it will be a department with a full...
No, I just want to be clear. I'm not going to get into the details. It's sort of my blanket statement on non-issued executive orders. But I do know that there is a commitment by the President and the staff that he has been very clear with us that he wants that done by the end of this month for obvious reasons. John.
Let me get back to where we were. The Human Rights Campaign, in responding to rescinding the guidance last night, said that this is not a states' rights issue, it's a civil rights issue, and therefore is in the purview of the federal government. Do you disagree that this is a civil rights issue?
It's not. It's a question of where it's appropriately addressed, and I think there's a reason. Like, we've got to remember, this guidance was enjoined last August by a court. It hasn't been enforced. There was no comment period by anyone, by the Human Rights Campaign, by teachers, parents, students. Nobody had any input of this. And it seems to me a little interesting that if this was any other issue, people would be crying foul that the process wasn't followed. The reality is that when you look at Title IX, it was enacted in 1972. The idea that this was even contemplated at that is preposterous on its face. But that doesn't mean that the president obviously understands the issue and the challenges that especially young children face. He just believes that this is that needs to be addressed by states. Various issues being states' rights, I don't see why this would be any different. And again, if you go through it, it's not just it's how the guidance was issued, it's the legal basis on which it was ordered. It fell short on a lot of stuff. It wasn't us that did this. It was the court that stepped in and said that they hadn't followed the procedure of the law back in August of last year and enjoined the case.
I understand all that. I'm just wondering, does the White House disagree with the position that this is a civil right?
Well, I think it's not a question of whether it's a civil right, it's where it's appropriately addressed. And as I noted, it's appropriately addressed at the state level. Kelly.
Sean, does the President personally believe that any student who is transgender should be able to use the bathroom of their choice, his personal belief?
I think the President believes it's a states' rights issue, and he's not going to get into determining. I understand what you're asking, Kelly, and I think that, as April pointed out, when the issue came to one of his own properties, he was very clear that, but again, what he doesn't want to do is force his issues or beliefs down. He believes it's a states' rights issue.
But the public may want to know where the President is.
I understand that, and I think that he is very sympathetic to children who deal with that, and that this is up to states and schools within a particular district to address how they want to accommodate that, and not sort of be prescriptive from Washington. That's what the President believes. Zeke.
Thanks, Sean. You mentioned that this order was enjoined by a court and there was criticism of the process. That exact same criticism has been levied on the administration's first executive order on the travel ban. I mean, can you help square the circle here? Why are you relying on that same, enjoined by a federal court criticism of the process for one, but not the other?
Well, I think there's a big difference. There's no way that you can read Title IX from 1972, anybody, and say that was even contemplated back then. It was. There's nobody that is possibly suggesting that the law that was passed in 1972 did that. Number two, there was zero comment period put forward on this guidance, which is in violation of how it was executed, okay? And so there's a big difference. Hold on. Let me answer the question, Z. There is also a strong reading when you read, 1182 U.S. Code, that it is very clear that the President does have the authority. So they are very much apples and oranges issues. One, it's very clear that the President is told by Congress in U.S. Code that he has the authority to do what's necessary to protect the American people. And there's no way that anybody above a fifth grade reading level could interpret that different. There is a difference between looking at a statute from 1972 and saying that something was complicated back then. Not only that, again, it's a multifaceted thing. When you look at how the guidance was issued, there was a zero comment period. Nobody was able to weigh in on that situation back then. And so when you're talking about forcing schools to make a huge accommodation from the federal level, and schools, parents, teachers, kids were not able to have any input in that decision from Washington, I think it's a very, very clear difference. John Gizzi.
Thank you, Sean. Just going back 2 weeks, in a story that got relatively little attention at the time, Chuck Cooper, a very distinguished lawyer, asked that his name be withdrawn when he was on the periphery of being named U.S. Solicitor General. So my question is a two-parter. First, can you confirm or deny the administration is now vetting Mr. Miguel Estrada, who is a former nominee for the Court of Appeals, as Solicitor General before the visa delay case gets to the Supreme Court? And second, Mr. Cooper said that he did not want to go through the same experience that Jeff Sessions, his good friend, did when he had the confirmation hearings and the vote in the Senate. Does that make the president a little bit discouraged about getting the nominees he wants for some very important positions?
Well, thanks, John. And I'd say on the first part, as you know, and I'll give you the same answer we give executive orders, we don't comment on personnel decisions until they're made, until they're finalized. So I've got nothing for that. On the second part, what I would say is that the president is very confident. We have a deep bench of folks who, during the transition, we talked about this, a number of people who've expressed a huge interest in joining the president in fulfilling this agenda. And that list is robust and long. However, that being said, I think for folks who have to go through the Senate confirmation and to watch what has happened to some of these fine individuals, the delay tactics, the tearing apart of their personal lives, it is discouraging for some of these people, I think, in terms of Mr. Cooper and others, who are looking at the process, saying, I would like to be part of this administration, help fulfill this vision and this agenda, but this is what I'm going to have to go through. So while this is somewhat of an isolated case, I definitely understand what he's talking about here. And I think, you know, those are few and far between. But I think that when you realize what is happening largely at the expense of Senate Democrats in terms of dragging these people through a very, very delayed and arduous process for purely political points, you know, I think that there's some people who could look at that process and potentially say, I don't want to serve. Luckily, we've not come to that beyond a handful of folks. Largely, people have a huge desire and are willing to make great sacrifice, both financially and personally, to serve in the administration, because I think they understand what potential change this president is bringing to this country and to the city. So, but I understand his point.
Sean, this morning the president talked about, as he often does when he talks about immigrants, he talks about really bad dudes.
Yeah.
You talked about precision. The Homeland Security Secretary this morning insisted there won't be mass deportation.
Right.
Is it the president's intent or desire, as some advocates worry, that people who are here illegally with something as simple as a traffic violation, that those people will be subject to deportation? Yes or no?
Well, I mean, I think everybody who is in this country, for obvious reasons, I mean, if you overstay a visa, if you commit a crime, you can't, by the very nature of you not being legal, you can be subject to deportation. That's by definition. Being in this country is a privilege, not a right, if you are a visitor. And I think we have a right to make sure that the people who are in this country are here for good and peaceful processes. And as I've said over and over again, there is a big difference. The president recognizes that there are millions of people in the country who are not here legally, and that we have to have a very systematic and pragmatic and methodical process of going through those individuals to make sure that the people who have posed a threat to public safety or have a criminal record are the first that are gone. What we've done, just to be clear, is to untie the hands of ICE and Border Patrol agents and say, your job is to enforce the law. First and foremost, to figure out who poses a threat to us. But in the previous administration, their hands have been tied. There was exception after exception after exception. And the fact of the matter is that we are a nation of laws, and we have to have a system of legal immigration that is respected. So I'm not going to be prescriptive in terms of what ICE's job is, but needless to say, their job and their mission is to protect the country and to enforce our borders and our immigration laws. And the president has basically instructed them to carry out their mission. And so the priorities, as we've discussed over and over and over again, is to do that in a way that is in accordance with the law, but also prioritizes those people that pose a threat. I'm going to go to Roby Brock from the Talk Business and Politics in Arkansas. Where is he from? Arkansas.
Hey, thanks, Sean. Roby Brock with Talk Business and Politics here in Arkansas, the home of the rowdiest town halls in the nation. I have a question on medical marijuana. Our state voters passed a medical marijuana amendment in November. Now we're in conflict with federal law, as many other states are. The Obama administration kind of chose not to strictly enforce those federal marijuana laws. My question to you is, with Jeff Sessions over at the Department of Justice as AG, what's going to be the Trump administration's position on marijuana legalization where it's in a state-federal conflict like this?
Thanks, Roby. There's two distinct issues here: medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. I think medical marijuana, I've said before that the president understands the pain and suffering that many people go through who are facing especially terminal diseases, and the comfort that some of these drugs, including medical marijuana, can bring to them. And that's one that Congress, through a rider in 2011, looking for a little help, I think put in an appropriations bill saying the Department of Justice wouldn't be funded to go after those folks. There's a big difference between that and recreational marijuana. And I think that when you see something like the opioid addiction crisis blossoming in so many states around this country, the last thing that we should be doing is encouraging people. There is still a federal law that we need to abide by in terms of the medical, when it comes to recreational marijuana and other drugs of that nature. So I think there's a big difference between medical marijuana, which states have the states where it's allowed in accordance with the appropriations rider have set forth a process to administer and regulate that usage versus recreational marijuana. That's a very, very different subject, and I think Shannon, Glenn, this isn't a TV program. We're gonna, Shannon, okay, you don't get to just yell out questions. We're gonna raise our hand like big boys and girls because it's not your job to just yell out questions. Shannon, please go.
Okay. Well, first on the manufacturing summit, was the AFL-CIO invited? And then, yeah, I did want to follow up on this medical marijuana question. So is the federal government then going to take some sort of action around this recreational marijuana in some of these states?
Well, I think that's a question for the Department of Justice. I do believe that you'll see greater enforcement of it. Because, again, there's a big difference between the medical use, which Congress has through an appropriations rider in 2014, made very clear what the intent of what their intent was in terms of how the Department of Justice would handle that issue. That's very different than the recreational use, which is something the Department of Justice, I think, will be further looking into. I'm sorry, Shannon, what was the first part?
Was the AFL-CIO invited to the manufacturing meeting today with the CF folks? Because they're not part of this manufacturing council.
Right. I think this was just focused on people who actually, they were not, I don't believe, part of this one. As you know, that we've had union representation at other meetings. I think this was specifically for people who are hiring people and the impediments that they're having to create additional jobs, hire more people. And obviously, while the president values their opinion, and that's why that they've been involved in some of the past, this was specifically a manufacturing, people who hire people, who manufacture, who grow the economy, who grow jobs, and that is a vastly different situation. Andre.
Thank you, Sean. I specifically sat here next to John to have it in on me. Thank you. A question on Russia. Secretary Tillerson and General Danford have had meetings with their Russian counterparts. Is the president pleased with the results of the meetings?
Yes.
And what comes next?
Yeah, both of them had an opportunity to meet with their counterparts in different locations, ironically, on the same day. I believe that was yesterday. And they both had very, very productive discussions. The president was very pleased with the outcome of that, and so I would refer you back to both General Dunford and Secretary Tillerson on those. But yeah,
you started discussing the where and when for the summit, for the leaders' meeting.
I don't have any updates on that, but I'll look into that. Cecilia.
I just want to follow up. I want to clarify.
Okay.
Make sure I understand what you said. You said you will see greater enforcement of it.
I would refer you to the Department of Justice. No, I know what I think. Then that's what I said. But I think the Department of Justice is the lead on that. It is something that you should follow up with them. But I believe that they are going to continue to enforce the laws in the books with respect to recreational marijuana versus.
Real question, if you don't mind.
That was the first one, pretty real.
Ivanka Trump was in the White House today for a meeting on human trafficking. She had this meeting on CEOs. We saw her in a smaller session here at the White House today. What exactly is her role here?
I think her role is to be helpful and provide input on a variety of areas that she has deep, passionate concerns about, especially in the area of women in the workforce. and empowering women. She is someone who has a lot of expertise and wants to offer that, especially in the area of trying to help women. And she understands that firsthand. And I think because of the success that she's had, her goal is to try to figure out, and the understanding that she has as a businesswoman, to use her expertise and understanding to empower and help women have the same kind of opportunity and success that she's had. So,
Still not a formal role?
no, I think that, no, nothing more than you've seen now. I think last night the meeting that she had in Baltimore was one that she was done on her own. There's areas that she's cared very passionately about before her time in the White House, before her father coming to the White House, rather. And now that her father's in the White House, that she continues to seek a platform that helps empower and lift up women and give them opportunities and think of ways that they can be.
Sean, thanks. On the human trafficking meeting today, the President said, well, when you talk about solving this kind of problem, that's a nice word, but it's really, he suggested that more likely he could just help out on that problem. What's his definition of success in this? What's his goal? Is he looking at stronger criminal penalties?
Well, Dave, I think that's, as I read out earlier, that the President understands that this is a serious problem both for adults, but particularly for children who are being sold both domestically and internationally, and it's why we brought these groups in. It's to make sure that we figure out how do we make that number as close to zero as possible, and that we institute policies both domestically but then abroad, in working with our partners to figure out how do we combat the trafficking of people. And it's things that we can be forceful in terms of the rhetoric that the President uses, but also the enforcement tools that he uses both domestically and internationally. Trey.
Sean, has the President been briefed at all on the situation at Standing Rock? And is he concerned that a standoff with protesters could slow down his executive orders on pipelines?